Excellent. Thank you so much, sir.
And my
Thanks so much.
sincerest apologies. This is the kind of security that Parliament has, and it keeps on changing the access codes and do not always inform us accordingly. So my apologies for your guests that had to wait a couple of minutes before I came online. But I'm happy to be with you.
Great, wonderful, sir. Sir, I'm going to introduce you briefly, and then I'm going to pose a few questions, and then we will get the audience to also pose a few questions to you, if that's okay with you. I should also tell you that this event is being recorded. Okay, so colleagues, we are happy to host the Honorable Ambassador Carl Niehaus. He's an MP for the EFF, representing Ward 117 in the Johannesburg region. He joined the liberation struggle at 19 years old. He was imprisoned as a political prisoner for 9 years on a charge of high treason. He was the former spokesperson of the ANC, former ambassador of South Africa to the Netherlands, former member of the ANC NEC, and in December 2022, you left the ANC, sir. So your CV is quite expansive, but I'll just focus on that. And I mean, before coming to the substance of what we're going to be discussing today, sir, I'd like to maybe reflect on your own political journey. You're an Afrikaner. You grew up in Zeerust, in what is now the Northwest Province. You went to university at Rand Afrikaans University, which is now UJ, and you were expelled there for your political activities. Maybe just reflect about your political conscientization that took you onto this journey as an Afrikaner growing up in apartheid South Africa to becoming a political activist.
Thank you, Professor Solomon. It is a long history, as you quite correctly say. I'll try to keep it as short as possible. My political journey of moving away from Afrikaner apartheid nationalism and racism started when I was still quite young. I was 16 years old. That was the first time that I engaged also with members of the Black and African community in Soweto. And I saw the conditions under which people were living in Soweto. And I finally then came to the conclusion that the apartheid system is rotten to the core and that it is evil. A year after that first conscientization, the 16th of June 1976 happened. It had an incredible impact on my political consciousness. I was convinced from the experiences that I had with fellow friends in Soweto and the lives that they were living under apartheid, that the uprising against the apartheid regime, and specifically the issue of Afrikaans in African schools, was a correct decision which was taken by many of the young people in Soweto and other parts of South Africa. I supported that uprising. I decided then to also raise my concerns about such within my own Afrikaans community and also within the Afrikaans middle class school in Witpoortjie in Krugersdorp, where I lived. I was almost expelled from the school for having done so. I did manage, however, to finish my grade 12, which we then still called matric. And then, as you correctly pointed out, Professor Solomon, I went to the Rand Afrikaans University, which at that stage was an all-white, mainly Afrikaans university. It was a creation of the Afrikaner Broederbond. The first rector and vice-chancellor of that university was also at the same time the chairman of the But I continued with my conviction that apartheid is wrong. And as a young student at the Rand Afrikaans University, I stood for the Student Representative Council. I called for an integrated university where all the people of South Africa should be able to be part of the student body. I also called for the release of President Nelson Mandela, who was still then incarcerated on Robben Island. And I ran a campaign to that effect. The consequence of that was that I was charged by the University Senate, and I was expelled from the university at a very young age. I was only 19 years old. It had a massive impact in my personal life, in the fact that my parents, especially my father, could not accept that decision by the university. He was strongly opposed to my political views, and he kicked me out of the house. So at the age of 19, I ended up without many friends. I was not necessarily integrated into the progressive political community in South Africa. I ended up walking the streets, literally being homeless. At that point, I then started reaching out to some of those who I knew were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle, among them also Father Simeon Kwane, who was at that stage the dean of the Anglican Church in Johannesburg, and he introduced me to Dr. Beyers Naudé, and that was truly a life-changing experience. Those of your guests on this forum who know who Dr. Beyers Naudé was, will know that he was a very strong opponent against apartheid, but at the same time, he came also, like myself, from the Afrikaner community, and he was an Afrikaner cleric who was expelled from the Dutch Reformed Church because of his opposition to apartheid. So Dr. Beyers Naudé, I always called him Wumbe, became my father. He became the father that my father could not be for me. And he became my mentor. I worked with him, especially in the township of Alexandra, where he was a fellow pastor in the Dutch Reformed Church in Africa, which was the black version of the Dutch Reformed Church. I also joined that church. I became involved in community activities in Alexandra. And then at the young age of just over 19, early 20s, 1979, June 1979, I finally decided to join the African National Congress and also the military wing of the ANC, Umkhonto we Sizwe. I did so with the full agreement and blessings of Dr. Naudé, who not many people know, but one can always again remind people that Dr. Naudé worked very closely with the African National Congress and was a very close personal friend of the then president of the African National Congress, President Oliver Reginald Tambo. So once I joined the ANC, I became involved in the underground. I worked inside the country. I carried out several operations for Umkhonto we Sizwe, which was the planting of limpet mines, also the identification of various targets in the armed struggle. But unfortunately for me, the cell that I worked in Alexandra was infiltrated by the old South African Security Police, and subsequently I was arrested together with a couple of other fellow comrades in that cell. And in late 1983, I was eventually, after a period of very severe torture, of detention without trial, I was eventually charged and sentenced to a so-called sentence of high treason, and I was given a 15-year prison sentence. Let me pause there because I can go on and on, but I think you would rather prefer to ask some further questions.
Mr. Niehaus, thank you. Now, you were a member of the ANC for 43 years, I believe. Okay. Can you go back to December 2022 when you resigned? What was the catalyst that made you give up your party membership?
If you look at my political history, you can see that within the African National Congress, over a significant period of time, not just over a couple of months, but years, I became increasingly concerned about what I would call the new liberal economic policies that were adopted by the ANC. And that concern actually started very early in the period of the unbanning of the African National Congress. I was very upset about a decision which unilaterally was apparently taken by President Nelson Mandela when he visited in 1991 for the first time the World Economic Forum in Davos, and unilaterally declared that the economic policy program of the ANC, which at that stage was determined by the Freedom Charter and was a program of nationalization of the large economic institutions of the country, the mines, the big businesses, was no longer the policy of the ANC. So I was one of those in the African National Congress for many years who was concerned about the fact that the ANC had moved away from its original national liberation objectives and roots. But as I said, I joined the ANC at a young age. And one of my characteristics, my personality is one of loyalty. So I believed very strongly that I should work within the African National Congress to bring the ANC back to those original roots for full liberation. Those ideals that I remember so clearly when I was a very young man and I was hiding away in my dad's garage and was listening on the little AM radio that I had to Radio Freedom, where the president of the ANC, Oliver Tambo, was describing the economic policies of the ANC. And he said that liberation is never just liberation from racism. It has to be also liberation from economic oppression. And he always used this term, racism and economic oppression in South Africa dovetails. So those were the reasons why I joined the ANC, and I was deeply unhappy about the direction that the ANC was going. And over the years, that unhappiness grew. It reached for me its apex with the farcical election of Cyril Ramaphosa as president of the African National Congress in 2017 at the 54th National Conference of the ANC. I was absolutely convinced that Ramaphosa did not, in a fair and equal manner, win that election, but that election was bought, that it was a corrupt intervention by white monopoly capitalism, that close to R1 billion was used to get Ramaphosa elected to the position of president of the ANC, and that the intention was to keep the ANC on this new liberal economic trajectory, one which was started, as I said already, by President Nelson Mandela, and unfortunately was the consequence also of far too many compromises that were made by the African National Congress during the CODESA negotiations. So I was very outspoken about my criticism. I'm sure participants in this forum will remember how I spoke out, how I protested, sometimes like my finger alone, outside meetings of the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress, criticizing the ANC's sell-out policies, also criticizing President Cyril Ramaphosa specifically as someone who is an agent within the African National Congress and doesn't truly reflect the policies and the historical liberation task of the African National Congress. As a consequence of those actions that I took, and which I stood for unequivocally so, the ANC then instituted disciplinary hearings against me. I criticized the judiciary also and said that the South African judiciary is captured. I strongly criticized the economic policy direction. And shortly before the 55th National Conference of the ANC, in fact, only 4 days before that conference commenced, the National Disciplinary Committee of the ANC, after they had taken me through a number of disciplinary hearings, then publicly announced, they didn't even show me the courtesy to inform me, they never even sent me a written letter to tell me that I've been expelled. They just announced it, that I've been expelled from the African National Congress. I expected such a thing to happen because in the last disciplinary hearing, the chair of that hearing said to some of the other members of the disciplinary committee, when he thought that I could not hear them, it was on a Zoom platform and they forgot to mute, we better move fast because you know that President Ramaphosa wants him expelled before the conference. So evidently, they didn't want me to be in that conference. So I was expelled, but I immediately appealed. And this is an important point that I always try to make. I did not simply accept my expulsion. I appealed that expulsion. And in terms of the African National Congress's constitution, once you appeal, your status as a member is reinstated until that appeal is heard. So therefore, on the basis of my appeal, I had the right to attend the 55th National Conference of the ANC. But what happened was, although it was constitutionally correct for me to be there, and I was a delegate from my branch in the ANC, and I also had the right to attend as a former member of the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress, what happened was that they refused me entry. In fact, when I went to collect my accreditation, the then head of the administration of the ANC, Phoebe Potgieter, brought police and they took me out of the accreditation center. It was then clear to me that there was no place any longer for me in the African National Congress. And I took the decision that I will wait to see what happens at that conference. And I will wait to see if Ramaphosa is again on the back of bribes, on the back of corruption, going to be re-elected as president of the ANC. And sadly so, it did happen. He was re-elected, and I can say without any fear of contradiction, re-elected again on the back of a corrupt arrangement and using bribes. And when that announcement came, it is then that I wrote a letter of resignation from the ANC. It is a long letter in which I predicted exactly what is going to happen in the future unfolding of the political situation in South Africa. I predicted the ANC is going to lose its majority. I predicted that it will go into a sell-out coalition with racist supremacists, such as the Democratic Alliance and the Freedom Front Plus. The letter speaks like a prophecy. And I'm proud to have that letter because my view and my understanding of what was happening in the ANC was absolutely correct. But it was a very painful decision, Professor Solomon. For days after I took that decision, I was physically ill. Because remember, The early part of what I described for you is how I joined the ANC at a very young age. I paid a huge price doing so. I dedicated my life to the liberation struggle. In fact, when I was charged with high treason, the judge, Mr. Justice Myburgh, when he eventually sentenced me, said that he was seriously considering to give me the death sentence. In fact, during the time that I gave evidence, he threatened me that he was going to give me the death sentence. And I replied to him, "Suit yourself, Your Honor." So it was a very, very difficult decision to leave the African National Congress, because I often said that for me, there was no other family but the ANC. My own family, Afrikaner conservative family, rejected me. My only family was the ANC. But
So
I felt that I could no longer stay under the current circumstances, and the fact that the ANC had betrayed its own national liberation journey.
Sir, thank you. You touched on my next question a little bit, but what are your thoughts on the government of national unity? Given the apparent contradictions, how long do you think it will survive?
Well, I'm fundamentally opposed to this grand coalition with white supremacist parties. In fact, I think it is a total fallacy to refer to it as a government of national unity. That is simply a propaganda term. It is no government of national unity. It is a grand coalition that the ANC entered into because it is now a minority party. It may still be the largest party in parliament, but it is a minority party. It no longer has the overall majority. So it was not reaching out to other political parties out of magnanimity. It was reaching out because that's the only way that they could still try and remain in power. The sad thing is that the African National Congress had a different option than to form a coalition with the Democratic Alliance, the Freedom Front Plus, and a few of those other small parties which are not so significant. They could have formed a coalition with the progressive political parties, namely the Economic Freedom Fighters and the MK Party, and when you do the calculations, it would have counted up to a solid majority. So the ANC took a deliberate decision to continue its route of selling out and now enter into a coalition with racists, continuing along this route of new liberal economic policy and selling out of the Black and especially the African majority. That reality was once again confirmed last week when we had the medium-term budget announcements by the Minister of Finance. New liberal economic policies on steroids, a total disregard for the majority of poor people in South Africa. And my condemnation of this so-called government of national unity is on the basis that it is a fundamental betrayal of everything that our national liberation struggle had ever stood for, and that you now have Cyril Ramaphosa and the ANC in a pathetic coalition with white supremacists. You saw yesterday what happened outside the Voortrekker Monument, where there was a coalition of right-wingers, so-called Afrikaner Boeramag people. And then suddenly you find that the Democratic Alliance is also there, protesting against one of the most important and significant provisions of the Bella Bill that would open schools for all the children and for all the races of South Africa and avoid a situation where the idea of self-determination and cultural identity can be used in order to keep certain schools white and exclusivist. And there you have John Steenhuisen, the leader of the Democratic Alliance, sitting next to ultra-right wingers with an old racist South African flag waving behind him. So these are the people that the ANC are in bed with. I believe that the contradictions are untenable. And to come to the last part of your question, I'm absolutely convinced that this coalition has so many fundamental contradictions that eventually it will fall apart. When that happens, it will be the litmus test for those who still think that there are progressives within the African National Congress. I don't believe Ramaphosa will be able to deal with anything in this regard. But those who still call themselves progressives in the ANC will then have to take a very critical decision about whether they will be able to enter into a coalition government with progressive political parties. And as I've said before, the numbers do count up to have a progressive coalition in our National Assembly and for a progressive national executive to be appointed. But the government of national unity as it exists at the moment is fundamentally flawed, and I do not believe it will survive.
Thank you, sir. Now, a number of senior EFF members, you are a member of the EFF in Parliament, a number of senior EFF members have been leaving the party for MK. What are your thoughts about the MK party, and what are your thoughts about the electoral prospects of your own party in terms of this upcoming local government elections?
It's going to be a bit of a long answer, but historically it must be understood properly. Because my own position with regards to the MK party can only be understood if you go back to about a year and a half ago. At that time, I was fully aware that former President Jacob Zuma was planning to announce the MK party. In fact, I was aware that in September already he had Mr. Jabulani registering the MK party. And I engaged with President Zuma and told him that I disagree with the formation of another political party, so to speak, on the left. I said the need is there to unite, not to create more separate parties. This morning, Advocate Dalian Porfo announced that he's now leaving the Economic Freedom Fighters and joining MK Party. And he referred to a meeting where all the leaders of progressive political parties were present in October last year. I was also there. What he should have done, he should have gone into the detail of what I said at that meeting. I said at that meeting that I'm opposed to the formation of more political parties. In fact, I asked the people who were sitting around that table, I think there were 10 leaders of various political parties around that table. I asked them, do any of you disagree with the expropriation of land without compensation? They said no. I said, do you disagree with the nationalization of the South African Reserve Bank? Do you believe that our state-owned enterprises need to continue to be under state control and that be strengthened as such? They all answered positively. I then said to them, and I pointed to all of them around that table, I said, then why are there so many of us around this table? Why don't we all unite? I said, I think the only reason why there's so many of you around this table is because of your egos. Because you like to see your faces on the lampposts during election time. Wasn't taken very well by some of those who were present there, but I had to deliver that message. When I left that meeting, I then went to my executive of the political party that I headed at that stage, the African Radical Economic Transformation Alliance. And I said to my executive, there is no way that I can continue to allow ARETA to exist after what I said in that meeting. It is about unity now, not more fractional little political parties. And I told them what I said in that meeting. I said, there's one party that has got a strong ideological foundation, is organizationally established throughout the country, and that is the economic freedom fighters. And therefore, I believe that all those other parties should join their forces, join their strength with the economic freedom fighters. I gave my executive 2 weeks to go and consider what I said to them. They came back to me and they said, we fully agree with you. We then took the decision to disband ARETA and as individuals to join the economic freedom fighters. Once that decision was taken, I went and visited former President Jacob Zuma. I said to him, I will not be joining this MK party that you are going to announce. And I want to emphasize it very clearly so that no one can play games about this. I knew in advance that the MK party was about to be announced by President Zuma. So I was not surprised when he eventually made that announcement. I told him, I will not join. I'm joining together with my fellow comrades in the African Radical Economic Transformation Alliance, the EFF, because I believe the EFF is the only truly progressive socialist political party with a strong ideological foundation that can take us forward. He did not like it. In fact, he got quite upset with me. I then requested, because I saw he was upset, I then requested to meet with him a couple of days later. I said, Baba, I can see you're not happy with my decision. Let me come with my executive and meet you in a few days' time, and we talk through this. Unfortunately, that meeting, when it was set up, when we arrived for the meeting, President Zuma decided that he was not going to have the meeting. So he expressed his dislike, his dissatisfaction with the decision that we had taken to join the economic freedom fighters. I also said to President Zuma in that discussion that I had with him, I believe that you will do much better rather than to start another party, the MK party, as he had done, to call on your supporters to support the economic freedom fighters and to bring everyone together. I said, even if you yourself feel that you can't join the EFF at this stage, call on your supporters to support the EFF. I'm still 100% convinced that the position that I've taken then was the correct position. That the ideological position that I took for the economic freedom fighters was absolutely accurate and correct. And if you ask me what I think of the MK party, my view is that the MK party is primarily built on an individual. It is not a party with strong organizational capability. It depends on the whims of one individual. Yes, it has grown during the last elections, but its organizational capability to sustain that growth does not exist. I do not believe that the MK party has a long-term future in South Africa. It had quite significant growth during the last election. It is now like a parasite taking people from other parties. It is busy poaching from the economic freedom fighters. That kind of thing, poaching, doesn't have integrity. It also doesn't show goodwill towards a fellow progressive political party. I'm fundamentally opposed to that kind of nonsense. I've been approached by some members of the MK party trying to poach me, and I sent them away with a knot in the ear because I absolutely reject such conduct. It is vile, it is unprincipled, and to treat another fellow progressive political party in that fashion is unacceptable. So the poaching that the EFF indulges in, that the MK party, my apology, that the MK party indulges in from EFF members is an indication of its ideological bankruptcy. The MK party doesn't have a strong ideological base. The MK party, to a very large extent, has simply cut and pasted the documents of the EFF into their own documents. They do not accept the intellectual property of the economic freedom fighters. They have, in many ways, stolen that property. I don't believe in the long term the MK party will survive, but I'm 100% sure that the economic freedom fighters will most definitely survive. It has got a strong base. It is ideologically well-founded. You can go and look at the 7 cardinal pillars of the EFF. You can also go and look at the discussion documents of the EFF for the upcoming National People's Assembly that will be held in December. And you will get a clear indication of a left progressive revolutionary party with strong branches throughout the country and the ability to sustain itself. We are going through a difficult time. I don't need to try and shy away from that. But we will move through this time. We will cleanse ourselves from those who are acting with betrayal rather than commitment. And the EFF will emerge from this process stronger than ever before. The EFF will continue to be the leader of the left revolutionary progressives in South Africa. And I can tell you, and I'm certain of this, also based on my own experience as someone who's been in politics for 45 years, the MK party is built on drift sand and it will eventually collapse. I don't wish it on them, but that's the reality. It will not survive in the long term because it is not built on clear, principled, and ideologically sound politics.
Thank you, Mr. Niehaus. Mr. Niehaus, you are not just any member of parliament. You happen to sit on the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee of Defence and Military Veterans. Given the parlous state of the South African National Defence Force, what are your thoughts? What are your insights?
Well, Professor, I'm sure that you and I share our deep concern about the current state of the South African National Defence Force. I had the privilege to have you together with a number of your colleagues from the Military Academy and also from the University of Stellenbosch, and you are from the University of the Free State, to have a colloquium with you about what are really the needs of the South African National Defence Force and where we find ourselves today. My biggest concern is that I don't think the SANDF has sat down and carefully considered what kind of defense force we need in South Africa. The problem is that there had twice been particular targets given to the Minister of Defense and Military Veterans, the former Minister Thandi Modise and now the current Minister Angie Motshekga, to come up with a strategy plan to be presented to President Cyril Ramaphosa. Those deadlines kept on being lost. They don't meet them because they're not clear about what kind of defense force we need in South Africa. The crisis that we are faced with at the moment is that in 2009, there was the Strategic Arms Procurement Package. Very expensive, very sophisticated weaponry were purchased. But sadly, and I've now begun to think actually deliberately so, there was no proper planning in terms of the budgetary requirements to maintain such sophisticated weaponry systems. And most of the Navy and in the South African Air Force have fallen into disrepair. The sad situation that we have today is that the South African Navy and the South African Navy dockyard in Simonstown is almost totally in operation. We cannot protect our territorial waters. The same problem prevails also for the South African Air Force. Recently, we had the disastrous storms that it hit certain parts of our country, especially the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal. And the head of the South African Air Force had to say, we cannot send out rescue missions because we cannot fly in these conditions. That's not because the conditions were so terrible. It's because the equipment that the South African Air Force should have operational to carry out such missions had fallen into disrepair. Now, the problem, of course, is to fund the repair of those very sophisticated weaponry systems is an expensive exercise. And we are going through a budgetary austerity process led by our national treasury, which means that in this financial year, 2024-2025, the South African National Defence Force has ended up with a 50 billion rand shortfall. But that is not where the problem ends. The problem also comes from the lack of ability of the leadership of the SANDF to prioritize what is required with the limited resources that they have. The top leadership of the SANDF have become fat, have become self-indulgent, continue to take care of themselves, and they do not take care of the majority of troops. The other problem that you have in the SANDF is that although the National Treasury has been asking the SANDF for the last 10 years to do rejuvenation of the force, to get younger and differently trained soldiers to come in, to find an exit mechanism for older soldiers who've reached a plateau, who've hit the ceiling in terms of their career development. But none of those policies, which the National Treasury had been pleading with the leadership of the SANDF to implement, have been properly implemented. So what you have is an old soldier corps, much older than the international average, which is acceptable as a good makeup of soldiers for any effective defense force. You have an over expenditure on cost for employment, and you have a maladministration in terms of the limited funds that are available. What I've just described for you is a disaster. And Professor, you will recall that in the Portfolio Committee for Defense and Military Veterans, I spoke that day when we had the colloquium, and I said that the SANDF is not just on the brink of collapsing, it is in the process of collapsing right now. Now, the fact that the Commander-in-Chief of the South African National Defence Force, Cyril Ramaphosa, allows this situation to continue. The fact that he allows one deadline after the other to be missed in terms of a proper strategical analysis of what is required and what kind of defence force we require means that he is fundamentally derelict in his execution of his duties. In fact, I've issued a statement a while ago saying that for me it is tantamount to treason, because the South African National Defence Force, in terms of our constitution, must defend our borders and our national integrity. The reality is that it's incapable of doing so. And Cyril Ramaphosa presides today over a collapsed South African National Defence Force, incapable of carrying out its constitutional duty. The only way this problem can be addressed is first and foremost that a clear vision needs to be developed about what kind of national defence force do we require in South Africa. Then, where are the essential areas where resources, limited as they are, must be directed to? How do we rejuvenate this force? How do we move out the old soldiers who are no longer effective? And how do we replace the current leadership core of the SANDF who have failed us and who have become very self-serving and self-indulgent? How do we replace them with a new, modernized, effective officer corps that can help us to develop this vision of what kind of defense force do we need in this country? We need to deal with the issue of large amounts of automatic illegal weapons that cross our borders from countries such as Mozambique and others into South Africa. The SANDF is totally incapable of doing so. They said that they needed, the army said they needed 22 units, border control units. They only have 50. The Treasury heard them. Our predecessor in the Portfolio Committee for Defense and Military Veterans in the 6th administration convinced Treasury to give them extra funds in order to set up those units and also to bring in electronic control mechanisms on the borders. They misappropriated that money. Today, they cannot tell you where those resources went to. So there is no way that we can hope for a defense force that will serve in the needs of our people, address the scourge of illegal semi-automatic weapons that are all over South Africa and has led to a situation where we have got one of the highest murder rates in the world, some of the worst violent crime being committed in the world, as long as our defense force cannot identify its real priorities and use the limited resources that it has to apply those resources to the areas that will make a true difference in the lives of our people. That is the sad reality.
Thank you very much, Mr. Niehaus. Mr. Niehaus, I know I told you that we'll end at 1 o'clock, but we started a bit later. If it's okay with you, I'm going to ask the audience if they have any further questions. Can I have some hands if any of you want to ask a pressing question to Mr. Niehaus?
I'm perfectly happy to stay longer. And again, my apologies that we had to start late.
Fully understandable, sir. There's a question from my colleague, Dr. Marusi Leshole.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Prof. And thank you so much, Mr. Niehaus, for your time. You might have in part touched on this, but I think I would love to hear a more pointed response. So what do you think it will take to have the Progressive Caucus come together, considering that the right-wingers are now emboldened than ever? Because in my thinking, it seems, quite far-fetched to think that either the EFF will join MK or the MK will join the EFF, considering the ego issues you mentioned. And I'm wondering if there were to be serious talks of a convergence of the left, perhaps would forming a somewhat neutral organization or party and having the other progressive parties join in that, and then they decide who will lead, would that possibly be more workable, or how do you see that happening? Thanks.
Look, I think the reality is that the MK party will have to change its modus operandi fundamentally. What MK party has done, as I refer to it, as the unprincipled poaching of EFF members, the way in which it had set itself up as a wrecking ball trying to destroy the economic freedom fighters is unacceptable, and you cannot build any hope for progressive cooperation on such a situation. So my view is very simple, and it's clear that the ball is in the court of the MK party to change its modus operandi. I don't think that there can be a hope for some kind of more neutral party to be created and then other parties will join. We have to accept political reality. The economic freedom fighters exist. It will continue to exist. It will continue to have its impact on the South African and African political landscape. And once we have maneuvered the current turbulent waters, we will emerge much stronger. As I've said to you, I think the jury is out very significantly so, whether the Umkhonto party will in the long term or even in the short to medium term be able to survive. It may look like a party that is growing strongly now, but I repeat once again that I believe that that party is built on ideological drift sand. It doesn't have a foundation. And while none of us hope for anything to happen to former President Jacob Zuma, we have to acknowledge that President Zuma is now in his 80s, and you cannot have a political party built on an individual, and especially on an individual of that advanced age. I've always been of the opinion that the future of South Africa is not with people like President Zuma or even someone like myself. I'm 64 years old. I've always been of the opinion that the future of South Africa must be built on the work and the leadership of young leaders, such as Julius Malema and many of the other strong and young leaders in the economic freedom fighters. And I'm convinced that that leadership will emerge and will eventually, as time progresses, become the leaders and the government of South Africa. But if you talk about the immediate term future, the ball is in the court of the MK party to change its unacceptable modus operandi, the manner in which it operates, the way in which it is poaching, the ideological lack of clarity that it has, the intellectual theft of other political parties, and specifically in the economic freedom fighters' intellectual property, must come to an end. The only way that we can possibly find a basis to work together is on the basis and on the foundation of integrity. And at the moment, the conduct of the MK party is the conduct of a party without integrity and without a political foundation.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Niehaus. Mr. Niehaus, I got two questions for you, two final questions for you from Ms. Motimele, Moshibudi Motimele. The first question, they are interrelated, sir. The first question is, if I could ask Mr. Niehaus to talk to us about his view on Julius Malema's leadership and whether or not it is a hindrance to the growth of the EFF. The second is that Floyd Shivambu has said that his move to MK is because of the need to build a united movement of left progressive forces. Why do you think he felt that the EFF had reached its limit as a vessel to do just that? If you could answer those two questions, please, sir. Final questions, I promise.
It's fine. We can even have further questions. Let me deal with the first, the last one about Floyd Shivambu first. I don't believe that Mr. Shivambu left the economic freedom fighters on the basis of wanting to build unity amongst the progressive left. I believe he left the economic freedom fighters from the basis of personal ambition and an unpreparedness to accept the discipline and democratic centralism of the economic freedom fighters. I do not believe that Mr. Shivambu's move to the MK party has in any way whatsoever contributed to building unity amongst what one would in general describe as the progressive left. In fact, he has achieved exactly the opposite, and that is to cause tension and to cause fraction. So his action, and I'm on the record as having said so, I did so also in a very long and extensive podcast interview on the EFF podcast platform, his action was betrayal and selfishness. It was not built on an ideologically sound position to build unity within the progressive left. If anything, he has achieved the exact opposite. With regards to the leadership of the president of the economic freedom fighters, the commander-in-chief, Julius Malema, I can only talk from my personal experience. And I read in the newspapers all this nonsense about a dictator, all this nonsense about someone who doesn't allow a diversity of views and an expression of one's views within the EFF. I've not seen that happening at all. In fact, I've seen a leader who's prepared to engage, a leader who believes in the need for democratic centralism, but democratic processes. It is not the EFF that doesn't have an upcoming conference. It is the MK party that has said it's not going to have any elective conferences. The Economic Freedom Fighters is having our National People's Assembly coming December. We go through democratic processes of building branches. We elect leadership in those branches, and from the branches up to the regions, to the provinces, to the national leadership, we have proper elective processes. So the leadership style of the commander-in-chief of the EFF is central democratic process. It is built on democratic centralism in the purest sense of the word, but it is certainly democratic. And what I've encountered from the Commander-in-Chief is someone who is deeply engaged with his fellow fighters and commissars, who deeply cares for them, who is a very encouraging leader, who wants to see them to grow and to blossom, but at the same time also expects from the whole cadership, the whole fighter and commissar cadership of the economic freedom fighters to be disciplined and to be loyal. And there's nothing wrong with that. Discipline and loyalty are the lifeblood of a professional, progressive, revolutionary political party. So that story that it is the leadership style of the Commander-in-Chief of the economic freedom fighters that is undermining the growth of the EFF is absolute poppycock. It is white monopoly capitalist propaganda, the kind of attacks that we have seen throughout all the years of the existence of the EFF, the 11 years of the EFF's existence. And it has always been because the EFF has been the strongest, the clearest, the soundest left political force in South Africa. And that's why the white monopoly capitalists in this country have identified the EFF as enemy number one. That is why the Democratic Alliance, and Helen Zille also said so, have identified the EFF and the president of the EFF, President Julius Malema, as enemy number one. And that's why we get this nonsense propaganda about a dictatorship. I don't see any dictatorship in the EFF. What I saw during the last while was that there is one person who prevails and takes all the decisions in the MK party. And yesterday it was revealed that members of parliament of the MK party had to pay their funds into a personal bank account for President Jacob Zuma. Now, none of this kind of thing happens within the economic freedom fighters. The contributions that we as members of parliament make go to our party account. It is properly accounted for. We know what those resources are used for. I can see how my contribution to the economic freedom fighters contributes to the growth of the branches of the EFF and building the organization. But you see, if the same story came out yesterday about what is happening in the MK party was ever to be accused or alleged to happen in the EFF, you will never hear the end of the story. The journalists from the SABC, from NCA, and from Newsroom Africa would have camped on the front doorstep of Winnie Madikizela Mandela House. But because it is another party, because it is not the EFF that these terrible revelations came from, we hardly hear about it. Now suddenly these same journalists who always shout from the top of the buildings and the mountains, insult and attacks on the EFF are muted. And that is the unfortunate reality. And I think the important thing is for all of us, also those who participate in this platform, to make a distinction between reality and propaganda. The issue around so-called dictatorship in the EFF is a Stratcom propaganda story that does not hold water.
Thank you so much, Mr. Niehaus. Dr. Leshole, I see your question, but I have to unfortunately bring this to an end. Mr. Niehaus, I really want to thank you very much for...
You don't want to give Dr. Leshole the last chance, the last
okay.
of the chariot.
Okay.
Please,
Well,
I'm available.
he's actually typed his question, and if you promise, if you don't mind to be short, sir, he asks
I'll
here.
try to be short. I'm a politician.
He actually types here, I've been worried about the so-called tight hand man syndrome, and the same worry applied with Floyd and Malema. My view was that if Malema was to send the presidency of the country, Floyd might have been gullible enough to be bought by the West to neutralize him. We have seen this in Africa with Sankara, Lumumba, Nkrumah, and others. Your thoughts on this, Mr. Niehaus?
Well, exactly. You've already seen what Floyd Shivambu did. So it confirms the concern that you had. And Floyd proved himself to be someone who is more concerned about his own personal progression and advancement, very selfish position that he had taken, and his preparedness to try and inflict as much damage as possible on the economic freedom fighters. So sadly, that concern, Doctor, that you've expressed is exactly what Floyd Shivambu demonstrated to us in his unprincipled conduct. That is the short answer that I would be able to give. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, Mr. Niehaus, thank you so much for sharing your time with us. And I look forward to engaging with you and members of your committee in Parliament, the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee of Defence and Military Veterans. And I wish that committee all the best, sir. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you all,
Professor.
colleagues, for being here.
Thank you so much. And thanks also for the wisdom that you've shared with us in the Portfolio Committee on Defence and Military Veterans. And as we said at the end of that colloquium, we would like to continue that engagement because your role in helping us to formulate that central question that I posed this afternoon in this meeting, what kind of South African National Defence Force do we require in South Africa on the basis of our limited resources and the specific demands and needs that we have in South Africa is critical. And I believe you and also the Military Academy can play a very, very significant role in assisting us along that road to come to clearer understanding of what is required. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. For the audience and Mr. Niehaus, you may not know this, but I met you 3 times in my life. The first time was in The Hague in the Netherlands when you were our ambassador there and you did an amazing job. The second time I invited you to speak when I was director of the Center for International Political Studies at the University of Pretoria. And then the third time was in Parliament when we were there. And I really look forward to meeting you a 4th time along your path on this political journey, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I remember all 3 those times, but I remember especially the one at the University of Pretoria because it was a bit of a time of upheaval and hostility. And I remember that before I went for that particular meeting, there were threats against my life. And if you will recall, I was actually addressing that meeting with a bulletproof vest on.
I think we both received death threats for that, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Goodbye.
But anyhow, I never allow myself to be intimidated by anyone. So I always enjoy straightforward, robust engagements. And thank you for giving me this opportunity today again. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.